In this video, we'll analyze the relationships that exist among prejudice, affirmative action programs, and production costs. Economists define discrimination as occurring whenever wages or employment opportunities, or both, are related to factors other than worker productivity. Gary Becker suggests that one cause of discrimination in labor markets is the existence of employer prejudice. Employer prejudice occurs when firms are willing to pay a premium to hire members of a preferred group, and conversely, are only willing to hire members of the non-preferred group when wages are sufficiently low to compensate for their distaste for that group. One thing that should be obvious is that if a primary cause of discrimination is employer prejudice, the firms that engage in discrimination must face higher costs because they're paying more than they need to in order to produce any given amount of output. In this diagram, we illustrate the possibility of employer prejudice, where we have two inputs, the underrepresented workers in the firm, and we have the favored workers. We're assuming here that the firms that are making the hire decisions do so on the basis of employer prejudice. If the firms were not prejudiced, they would choose a cost-minimizing mix of inputs at point B. Instead, they choose a mix of inputs where they use more workers from their favored workers and fewer of the underrepresented worker. As we can see, this puts the firm at a higher level of cost at point A than it would be if it's minimizing costs. If an affirmative action program was introduced here that required firms to use a mix of workers equivalent to the mix of workers in the labor force, the costs of labor and the cost of production would go down as a firm moves from point A to point B. So in this case, discriminating firms would actually end up with lower costs once they were forced to stop discriminating. If, on the other hand, a firm is not engaged in discrimination, but the workers that are underrepresented have a different mix of skills and training than workers that are overrepresented, then what would happen is requiring that firms use a mix of resources that reflect the mix of workers in the labor force would move the firm from points such as point A to point B, which would mean basically the firm would end up with a more costly mix of inputs. So basically what we find is that introducing affirmative action would lower the cost when firms are engaged in discrimination, but if firms were not engaged in discrimination but were making hiring decisions on this basis of worker productivity, causing the firm to move to a more balanced mix of the labor force could lead to higher production costs, as in this example. In summary, when firms are engaged in discrimination, the introduction of an affirmative action program can lower the firm's costs. On the other hand, if firms are not engaged in discrimination, introducing an affirmative action program would result in higher costs for those firms. On the other hand, an affirmative action program can still be justified if the introduction of affirmative action offsets the effect of past discrimination. Because presumably if there's a difference in the level of human capital between the two groups of workers, that may very well have been because of differences in education, differences in family wealth, and other factors, and introducing affirmative action can equalize some of those differences and provide more equal outcomes, and can lead to more human capital accumulation among the groups that currently have artificially low levels of human capital.